Hello, this is Marina Crane back again for another podcast. It's August 12th, 2026, and I'm here with a guest who is going to be somehow interviewing me, and we'll do some back and forth conversations, and hopefully we'll give you some insight into the dynamics of, um, we'll call it systemic racism or lateral violence. Okay. But I won't introduce your name for so she has there's some confidentiality here. Okay, thank you.
So Marina, you talk about wanting to kind of solidify establishing some of your personal history, and you've shared lots of your kind of lived experiences and knowledge in some of your previous podcasts. But a piece here that you're like wanting I want to know more about was how did you work towards creating your own secure place within this community? And hearing that you've had um, a huge transformative phase between the ages of 15 and 25 where things were all about growth and changed, and all of those challenges persisted until the age of 25. So what was that experience like for you? How did that change?
Well, I think it had a lot to do, like in terms of my being an elder now, is reflection on what it is I knew about healthy human sexuality, what I knew about like family dynamics, or even how community gets involved or doesn't get involved, as well as I was in denial of Indian residential school trauma. Uh, in the 70s, there was very little alcohol and drug abuse because Indigenous people weren't allowed into bars. And the only the only scandalous thing was the gossip of prostitution in the city of Regina and the odd Calgary Stampede, prostitution happening with oil riggers that come into the city, for R&R. But the majority of times, I think I didn't even know that non-Indigenous people had trauma. And so when I uh, was a lot with involved with a lot of non-Indigenous people, I think I was safe in a sense, but at the same time too, my connection to Indigenous politics really helped in the fact that I joined a youth group and had some elders who were really supportive. And in that youth group, there was Tantu Cardinal, Lloyd Cabiosi, Bill Larondel, Gary Ladisser, Nancy Dion. Like there were so many youth, late John Campbell, Will Campbell, Maria Campbell. There were there was something happening. There wasn't that much news media, and so just getting any kind of Indigenous news, was next to nothing. It's not like today when you have social media. But at the same time, when I reflect with other elders who, like as we successfully have lived this long, who belong to that youth group, I think the primary thing that we're really blessed was that we had elders who were supportive of us and guided us. Whereas now that we're elders, we're realizing that a lot of our youth don't have that. They don't have that same connection to the elders as we did.
Mhm. So that for me plays into the next question, like some of the early struggles you had and coming back into community and understanding the policies that community had. And so you working hard to, create a budget, talk to community about establishing a home base here for you. But because of, politics and some of the misogyny practices that happened, that it wasn't a possibility for you at that time. Um, so how does that how those lived experiences from that young age and what you see as reflection now kind of play into that experience that you had, as a young person coming back into your community and seeing the policies not being helpful?
Well, I think now the dynamics of grooming and trafficking are so normal. They've normalized it. Whereas when I was younger, I didn't really understand it, but I'm glad I didn't participate. I'm glad in some ways it was a mixed blessing that I was treated the way I was treated because I was single and I was a sexually active female that wasn't married. Because in the 70s, a woman couldn't own a credit card or own a home, and birth control was just like a revolutionary thing. So there were all these attitudes towards women's sexuality and, keep it quiet, don't talk about it. Whereas today, I think our young people, um, if they don't have an education, then they're basically stuck within the system of getting a job, uh, being coerced in some ways of not wanting to do something, but their livelihood is put at risk. And I don't think people realize that that's part of trafficking and grooming. You're grooming people who don't have a degree for a job that they may not even be qualified for. Whereas for me, the way I was treated, especially when I established a daycare center and a detox treatment center, the budgets, all I wanted was a place where I could live in the basement and call my place. I knew I wasn't qualified to be anything, but at least I knew there was money available to hire people.
Mhm.
But at the same time, too, I really think it was the impetus of doing something not for myself but for others. Even though I was trying to have a place to live, I think the foundation of mental health, when it comes for anybody to do something, it's to do it to help the community rather than yourself. So it becomes what people call holistic, a holistic approach to mental health. I understand that now, whereas if I hadn't had that experience of misogyny, I wouldn't embrace it as I do now.
So you also speak about after those experiences where you created those budgets, for a daycare and for a addiction treatment center, that you struggled in looking for education or pursuing education, but you knew that was something that you needed to do and completing your high school. And then it says that you looked at your journey beginning in Utah in the 1976, where you went and did your university program and update. And what did that look like? How did that shift from going from creating budgets, knowing that you weren't being supported, all you wanted was a home base, to motivating you to pursue your education and to bring you to a different place?
I think I was very naive. Well, I was also very naive into cults because in Utah, Mormonism, I walked right into it. And in hindsight, when I reflect about my own family experience, I'm going, why was it so easy for my family to be converted to any kind of religion? So the first was Anglican religion, then moral rearmament, where my parents traveled to South America and India, and then Mormonism, and then now, like when um, like sweats and ceremonies. So it was very easily influenced, almost in the sense of being gullible, because I truly think that the inability to have healthy boundaries makes people vulnerable to people who want to control you or have that ideology that like God is white. So yes, it changed me because I had a false sense that I needed to work hard because there was no alcohol or drugs, but yet the propensity for deviant behavior within the state of Utah, and even the psychology and the courses that I took, attending a ritual abuse conference, understanding the cult mentality of even within the Mormon religion. But I want to also say that it's in all religions. The education that I received, I'm grateful for, but at the same time, too, I think it helped me with critical thinking and the fact that the way I was treated as an Indigenous woman was no different than how my parents were treated in Indian residential school, like I was lower class. Because in Mormonism, the whiter your skin, the more godlike you are. So that again, that's what to me, if I hadn't gone and experienced that, I wouldn't have realized like it's part of learned helplessness, or it wasn't because of my parents not understanding. It was just in those residential schools they were groomed and they were trafficked, and for my parents to believe that that's normal and teach it to their children.
Yeah. So when you were going through all of that, you were also away from your community for a long time. pursuing your education. And you also talk about not getting any support from your community while going to school. And that shaped, your perspective around how community managed students that were living, off reserve.
Yes, like when I excuse me, when I came back, I became education director
Mhm.
because I had empathy for university students, especially because I had to work full time, pay for my tuition, and study full time in Utah because the federal government was only sponsoring people, Indigenous people who had their high school diploma to become teachers. So it was very one-sided. At the same time, too, the Indian Act had stated that if you received your university degree, you would no longer have Indian status. So a lot of this education had conditions, again, trafficked, put under pressure that you can't get government help unless you actually do what they want you to do and become a teacher.
Mhm.
I bike to work. I went to school. Like I said, I worked at any job that I had roommates. Like right now, I have my own place, and it's because I love that because I just hated having roommates.
Mm.
So there is some peace and happiness that I have in the sense that I have some comfort, but at the same time, I cherish the experience that I had.
Mm. Yeah, and then as your role as the director of education, how did that play into your workplace dynamics and leadership influence, both for your role as well as chief of council?
Well, a lot of times too, most of the chief and council don't understand the policies. And so I was just basically thrown into the position without knowing. I didn't know the policies that were changing, and I would spend like anywhere from 15 hours just doing things in education. I only had one staff member, and even trying to hire anybody, it was next to impossible. And two of my staff who were working with students were making $2,000 to $3,000 more than me, and yet I'm their boss. But again, too, it was because of not what you know, but who you know.
Mhm.
And because I followed through on all the policies and the tripart agreements, I found out where money was going and how it was spent. And a lot of times, management was taking this money that shouldn't have been taking it didn't like it,
Mhm.
and even because I looked after transportation, post secondary, I looked after everything, even having meetings with the school Calgary School Board and the private school boards. So, and there was such a push for special education as well. So a lot of people, I think a lot of academics were taking advantage of Sutina, but my making it aware they wanted to silence me, especially politicians who were making money from education. So I was approached by leadership, but a particular chief who said, "Well, we don't want you in this position anymore, but I will transfer you to another position in research." So he was creating a job for me, and I know that if I had taken that job, I would have been trafficked. That, in other words, because I would be obligated to him for having job security. If I didn't obey him and do what he wanted me to do, I could lose my job. But I already had experience working off reserve, and I knew that it would come at a price, and I said, "No, I'm not willing to pay that price."
And another, like going on that, you talk a lot about the challenges in the community around housing policy and leadership. And so you mentioned previously about you now having your own home and after living abroad and not in your community, how does that off reserve policy as of now impact your kind of your worldview?
Well, when I say I lived in Utah, I had no help from chief and council. They didn't pay my rent. If I had to come back to Calgary back and forth, I paid my own. Even when it came to funerals and stuff, I paid my own. So not once did leadership help me out. But in the whole scheme of things, when they had Black Bear Crossing, and there was a whole bunch of people who were living in homes because of the housing shortage, that it was all of a sudden like, oh my goodness, it became like an awakening. Like, is this how many people don't have homes? And so they opened up a program for off reserve housing. So anybody who was had their high school diploma, who was going into post-secondary that needed subsidy, or anybody who was working full-time who needed subsidy or just needed their rent paid for, they paid for it. Because when they evacuated back Black Bear Crossing, there were hundreds of people who were going to be left homeless. So they had to establish rent agreements within the city. So that being said, the policy had stated that if you were independent, that means you were old enough to go to university, old enough to vote, old enough to have a job, they would help you out. But that's not the case. That's not the case today, because, again, I think it has to do with I don't like grooming and trafficking. There are some very powerful elders and very powerful people who've lived here the whole lives, that request things from chief and council, and the chief and council pays for them, pays for their family without question, without any sense of getting reimbursed. And for me, that, like, why do they do that? I'm the person I am because I worked hard for it. They're basically enabling people to succumb to being trafficked. Like, why would somebody subject themselves to obeying leadership when leadership can say, I can take your rent away at any time?
Let's see. Okay. And I would like to kind of go back a little bit, Marina. I'm talking about your community background and saying that you've grown up really closely in your culture. And part of your identity is Dakota Sioux and growing up with your grandmothers and your great grandmothers. How does this play into your perspectives around policy and community and how all of this plays into each other?
Well, um, a lot of the decisions I've made had to do with me taking care of my late mother. It was just something like in Dakota Sioux, how each five of the main old, like five of the first oldest have different names and different duties. So I was basically groomed. It's a cultural thing, but it's a very powerful thing too, because that means, like in Sutina, you have a say. It's almost like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Uh, People are privileged to grow old, and when you grow older and people see you as having lived knowledge, then you become a blessing to the community. So with the Sioux background, it was just that's just accepted. I'm not saying that it's the way it is today. It's just the way that I saw it growing up, and how my grandmothers all came together as sisters. My aunts all came together as aunties. It was just something that was just very traditional.
And then moving on a bit more is, the influence of Nathan Chasen Horse and how leadership decision making happened when that individual came into this community. So how did that affect Nathan Chasen Horse coming into this community, and how did that affect the relationship with leadership?
Well, I can only talk about the months that I was associated with him, financial in terms of finances, because I organized about 5 or 6 ceremonies, which ran about $6,000 each. On top of that, like within my own home, his followers stayed in the basement here because they came across as being very poor. They needed assistance. And in the Sioux way, it's called Unshika, you're very pitiful. So you have to go to their level and bring them up. So for me, having lived in the States and knowing how hard it was just to pay rent, I opened my house to them. At the same time, though, too, when the disclosure of him having sexual interference with Roberta, I stopped having any contact with him in the fall of 2007. However, by that time, there were already 6 ceremonies that he had attended in Sutina, and various members of leadership were gravitating toward him. So by 2015, he'd been here already 8 years. 8 years that I didn't know about, 8 years that I don't know how much money went into him. But I do know that the girls, the 14, 15, 16-year-olds that he did take with him, that the chief and council or powers that be, there are just certain members in leadership who paid for the rent of these children. These children weren't accompanied by their parents. They were basically his child brides, and they supported them by paying their rent. And the management who disclosed and had confronted leadership about this inappropriateness were fired. They were let go. So yes, the policies were playing really extreme when I heard that, because for me, I worked, I wasn't sexually active with no medicine person. The having association with a medicine person wasn't giving me any benefits, but the enabling of the grooming, so that these girls were being looked after because they were associated with him, and because he was in good standings with the families. Anytime he was needed to come in for ceremony, he was there at their beck and call. Like my niece would do schedules like his private secretary, and people would approach her and say, we want to come in, and she'd make arrangements to get money for him, places to stay, and have ceremonies until a different chief was voted in, and in 2016 he was banished.
So that changed then the accountability of leadership and the victims that were associated with Nathan.
To some extent, I believe that there was still money being paid out to some of them for rent. And the thing is that it wasn't just children now. There were adults who were actually from Sutina who were actually living in Las Vegas that they were paying rent for. And one of the ladies had married into the community, and I think she, from my understanding, over $200,000 in rent. And just the ability or the inability for her to step back and form boundaries and say like that she's being used, because it's not a question of her being sexually assaulted, it's a question of her having been groomed and trafficked because of like her association with him.
And so moving on with that, Marina, you talk about reflections on the Indigenous family safety and systemic challenges that you've witnessed and experienced. And so what are some of the general perspectives in the role of women over the years and as of like how you see it today?
Well, I don't think the women in my community are ready for a woman chief. I just don't think so, because I think that there's such a propensity for men towards boys. We see it in leadership this past week, where one of our leaders got arrested for a historical sexual assault that happened when these men were in their 30s. And that to me as a female, I'm relieved. I'm really happy that they had the courage to disclose. At the same time too, I'm relieved in the sense that there are probably more victims within my community, and not just my community. I believe in other provinces that can come forward now and and say, have the courage to say that they were hurt by this leader. I think until these types of we'll say a name is given. These young men were assaulted. That's the name of it. Holding space for them, so the police charged them, and so there's space held for them until they can go to court. when they go to court, just they will bear witness of just the injustice that was given to them, and they'll seek out justice. Those things need to happen in order for, I believe, women to have a voice and have security that our men are going to look after the women and children. Because if the men are victims, if the men are victims of the men, then how, as women, are we strong enough to support, to, to find safety for our children?
So I'm thinking about that, Marina, in terms of like how then as Indigenous people do we enact our understanding of shared knowledge and common, recognizing common experiences? Because from what I just heard, these two gentlemen have had a common experience. So how do we share knowledge as Indigenous people to kind of um, start healing and start working with community to understand grooming and trafficking beyond like the sexual context?
Well, when Nathan Chasing Horse was arrested, and there's still more happening, the background of it and the discourse or the storytelling that I took part in. There were a lot of young men who were interested in like the grooming and the trafficking part of it. And so they started having meetings. Now, having conversations about sexual assault, I think, was important for these young men. And I'm just assuming they had to have had connections with other men, because I spoke to one of the leadership. Now, when I talk about leadership, I'm hoping people, not just Sutuna people, but just leadership in general, men. If you have had if you've hurt any child, any woman, any human being, do think twice before running for council. Think twice before going into politics, because there's no statute of limitations. These victims someday will find courage to lay charges. So for me, in the community, when these young men have been talking, especially like this, because it was a big thing with Nathan Chasing Horse, and all the decades that he was allowed to run freely, and the many tribes that supported him. Of course, in the community, it's going to be talked about, especially when band funds were being used. And so the young men were saying, like, what happened? Why were people paid this and that? And a lot of leadership didn't like it that a lot of the young men were talking. But I strongly believe that because there were conversations, different meetings that they were having, that somehow these young men, they don't know each other. They don't know that, like, from my understanding, they know, like how do I put it? There's confidentiality in who the victims were. But as more victims come forward, like, let me put it this way: it takes a community to raise a child, and it takes a community to heal a child. So it took a community of men to start talking, and now it's going to take a community of men to help heal other men. And they've started having like men's groups too in the past 2 years. Healthy Living has been trying to help young men, and I think that's the key thing, because I think a lot of times, as women, I think sometimes we've because we have this false illusion that we have power, and so it's just like the person who calls wolf, and everybody comes and attack, oh, you poor thing. In the meantime, who's being dismissed? The boys, the men. And so I'm really grateful, that they came forward. And anytime anybody talks to me about it, even in social media, I will just say no. I support these victims. It takes more courage for a male to come forward and disclose than it does for a female. And again, how girls and boys react to trauma is totally different biologically. And I think the more people understand the differences in male and female sexual response, the healthier our community is going to be.
Yeah, and that comes into another, like, a protective factor, Marina, that you have talked about before, is ensuring that we're establishing boundaries and protecting our family are essential in protecting our young people and whatnot. So how do we continue or work on building that to be a broader practice within our community?
Well, I believe it starts within the family. Like most of the conversation, when people were talking to me about my niece Roberta, they said, "Do you have the right to talk about her story?" And I said, I'm not her mother, I'm her auntie. I'm not her brother or sister, I'm her auntie. So again, like what are the boundaries in place? I think, and I said again, it takes it my being involved with my own family didn't help Roberta at all. What needed to happen was needed to be more families involved. When my brother was arrested for sexual interference with Roberta, I went to chief and council. I pleaded on the behalf of my brother's children to keep them on the reserve in foster care. I could not do that for Roberta because she wasn't a nation member. And because of that, she fell through the cracks. So it takes family and other families to help. And hopefully, like, there's a lesson here that it takes other programs within the community to help other programs to help families heal. I don't think there's um, you can't say abracadabra. It's not that easy. Like I said, you have to challenge it and giving it a name, holding space and bear witness to injustice. Though that's like if there was a magic word, that would be the process. But saying it and actually doing it takes time. Like from the time Roberta disclosed to me until the time she realized what Nathan had done to her was a period of 8 years. It took that long for her to let go of this illusion that this man was in love with her.
Yeah. And so with that, with Roberta's, experience and story, and from what you can speak to, there's mention of in child psychology, missing means more than just a physical absence. And how is that in relation to Roberta and also maybe other young people and playing into their high risk behavior?
Well, um, here's an example. When I was interviewed by nation members, a young man and woman, I knew his mother, this young man's mother, and we used to get on the bus every day for years, sitting together on the bus, and we so in the mornings and then evenings we'd be bussed. We had different. We were in the same grade, but it was just that connection that we had every day. And so I got to know, like she talk about the books she read. She talk about just beautiful things like what she thought life was about. She was innocent. She was vibrant. She was had so much potential. And that's the same thing with my niece Roberta. There, when the Sioux and the Indigenous people say that children are raised to be holy, I saw holy people. When I was a child going to school, as a child, I saw that. Now, I don't know why Creator has blessed me to see this. However, when I'm talking to this young man about his mom, I said, the potential and the leadership she had, and this is the same thing with Roberta, all of a sudden they went missing. Their spirit was gone. The inspiration of the possibilities of life, psychologically and spiritually, they were gone missing. They were there physically, but any connection that I could even have to rekindle that spark that I had experienced with them was gone forever. Somebody had destroyed their lives. Somebody had done something unforgivable. So I tend to think, and I didn't quite get the gist of it about murdered and missing Indigenous people, but from childhood psychology, when you see that innocence that's holy, then when it goes missing, and you're trying to make that connection for years, like 8, 10 years, 20 years, and then they end up overdosing with drugs, like Roberta, and or they go murdered through prostitution. Like to me, it's not just an Indigenous issue. I know it is in the sense that there's so many statistic wise, but I think it's because people, non-Indigenous people, want to project that. They want to project it on Indigenous people. It's such an easy thing to do, to victimize the victim. And yet, when people do that, they're projecting their own insecurities, society's insecurity, to look at their own selves. Because understand, my understanding of this came from studying. And it wasn't with Indigenous people, it was with non-Indigenous people. Look, I was looking after non-Indigenous teenagers. I saw the horrors of what human beings could do to children and the damage throughout their lives.
So with all of that, Marina, like what are the dangers of, an individual and communities being in denial of what's going on with our young people? And why do we need to remain vigilant?
Well, it's so easy to be manipulated. I didn't know until my 20s what manipulation was. I didn't even know if I was doing it because, again, like if I'm raised by parents who went to Indian residential school, and they think grooming and trafficking is normal, and and I as a teenager, I'm thinking, oh, this people aren't behaving the way they're supposed to be behaving, but but yet I think it's normal. But I do think because I stepped out of that culture, like every day I'd be bussed into the city, come back into Sutina. Every day there was a different experience with different people. I think that interaction with different cultures and different people really made me more vigilant of like the possibilities of what's out there. Like I said, I didn't even know to the extent of that I was around non-Indigenous kids who were victims of incest. Because they're in this public school system, and then you see them abusing alcohol and drugs and or going into gangs. I didn't understand that because, again, my parents weren't talking about sex education. When I talked to academics about my late mother and the lack of sex education in those residential schools, I said when she first was pregnant, she thought she was going to have a litter of puppies. And I had one of the academics laughing, and I said, no, you've got to understand this. She was not raised by her Indigenous parents, nor was my father. They were raised by non-Indigenous people in those Indian residential schools who did not care to educate them about healthy human sexuality. So if we are in denial and if we are not vigilant in who's teaching our children what is appropriate or inappropriate, then we're just going to repeat the same thing that non-Indigenous people assumed of us. And we're not that.
So with that, Marina, how do like the systemic barriers that, our community, even non-Indigenous communities face, play into Roberta's story and what happened with her? Systemic barriers. How did that stop some of maybe the help that she could have gotten and couldn't get?
Well, the fact that Child and Family, I couldn't have any connection with her. Child and Family didn't do anything to establish a healthy relationship between me and Roberta. They basically just assumed I was guilty as my brother, that I was participating in my brother trafficking Roberta, that I was, guilty of grooming her. That in itself is a barrier. That Child and Family, who is supposed to be from within the community that I've grown up with, should know me. I was already I wasn't even in my 20s or 30s. I was in my 40s, and yet Child and Family was treating me this way. And yet, if Roberta had been a nation member, she would have been able to be left with my siblings or myself,
Mhm.
but they didn't.
Mhm. Yeah, and then so a part of that in terms of like prevention, you talk about your suspicions and the early signs that you had witnessed um, with Roberta as a young person, as a young child.
Yes, I like I said, she was adorable. She some like she had an unhealthy start of life. She was already born addicted. She was given up by her mother when she was 2 years old. She came back to her mother when she was 8, and by that time it was already documented that she'd been sexually assaulted in foster care in Vancouver. So she acted out a lot sexually, and like it's really difficult to comprehend, but she would do anything just so that you would love her. Like, look at me, just like a normal child wanting attention. But sometimes she took it a little too far, and that's not her fault. It's just because of the nature of her capacity. Like a vulnerable child with different learning disabilities. They're like, do people do people realize like there's so many of our children whose parents were drinking and drugging, and they were born with brain damage, and that their capacity to understand healthy boundaries isn't there.
Mhm.
I mean, I when I was director of education, there was a need for special education, and there still is a need, but I do think that um, something has to be done for children.
Mhm.
They just because it's not their fault that there was an addiction with the mom, and I tend to think that whatever skills we can give children, just even conversation or just some sort of normalcy
Mhm.
in what parents and children should how they should be interacting with each other.
Mhm. And so when Roberta was ready to talk about what was going on with Nathan, how did that happen, and what were the reactions of the family?
Oh, that that is the most stressful thing that I've ever experienced in my life.
Mm.
Most of the clients that I'd worked with had already disclosed, and I was only looking after them after the fact to be the one that initiated the disclosure, like to make it public, is something totally different. I had suspected something was happening with Roberta. Uh, I wasn't too sure if it was with my brother because my brother had a girlfriend, but it was Roberta's inappropriate behavior with the girlfriend's son, or Roberta's inappropriate clinging to my brother, or when her brother and sister would come over to play, I'd wondered where is she, and I'd call my brother. I said, "Where's Roberta?" "Oh, she's here." And I'm going, "Well, why is she being separated from her brother and sister?" So it wasn't that I wasn't following through. I was following through to the best ability that I had, and so when I was volunteering with the mums and daughters for ceremony for Nathan, I didn't include Roberta because Nathan was already sleeping over at my brother's
Mhm.
place. Little did I know that he was sexually interfering with Roberta under the under the roof of my brother. I didn't know that. I was just concerned about the parents, the mothers who wanted to help their daughters because the daughters were like there were 10 of them. They'd go in
Mhm.
as a group into the city, and they were like 15, 16 years old, and the moms were scared. They were scared somebody was going to get them, traffic them, murdered and missing, indigenous, like they were afraid, and they wanted to have some sort of bond with their daughters. So I was busy volunteering, trying to raise money for Nathan, networking with Chief and Council. And Roberta came over. And the thing is, to this day, I think, did Nathan, encourage her to come over? Because there was no reason for her to come over. I think he planned this. She came over and I had the computer open. I was writing a proposal. And that's when she was telling me, oh, he bought me this. It was an outfit. She said, he bought me this shirt and these Levi's. And she said, he bought me 5 pairs. Now, that's like $1,000 worth of clothing. And I had a picture. I said, there was a picture. It was in March of Cowboys and Indians magazine, and Nathan was in there. And I said, he's got a girlfriend, Roberta. Now, I said, he's shown me a picture of his girlfriend and his daughter. Like his daughter's quite famous. This particular daughter, mind you, I'm trying to get explained. I did not know he had 10 children by that. Okay, this is before I knew how promiscuous he was and just how many children he was fathered. But I said to Roberta, he's got a girlfriend, and she says no, he doesn't love her. He told me he doesn't love her. He says he only has sex with people. He only has sex with me because he loves me. And then that's when I just said, what? And so when I confronted her about that, like I said, what? I said, Roberta, he only has sex with you? And then she ran out the door down here. I went running after her. By the time I opened the door, she was on the phone with Nathan. So I don't know if it was a setup or what. She ran back to my brother's place across behind over here. I got in the car and I went to this my cousin's partner, who was a psychologist. She got on the phone with Nathan and was on the phone for a whole hour. After the hour was over, she said to me, "Well, Marina, Roberta's delusional." This is coming from a psychologist. Didn't call the tribal police, nothing. And this was, like I said, in March. By May and June, Roberta was already heading down to Bear Butte, preparing for Sundance, and that I confronted her in front of all the people who were supporting and trying to get down to the Sundance. I said, you can't not go into these ceremonies lying because what you told me. And she said, no, I didn't tell you nothing. Then she went down to the Sundance, and again, Nathan hadn't come home, hadn't come up to Canada. So I didn't disclose to tribal police. When he came up, because he was in the States, I thought the only way I can confide in the tribal police is when he's here in Canada. So he came up in the fall, and that's when I disclosed. But see, I had disclosed after my brother was arrested. So nobody believed me. And the tribal police came here in 2023 apologizing for the fact that they did not take my disclosure serious.
So after your siblings were arrested, there's, conversation around Roberta wanting visitation with her siblings before she turned 18. And a piece of that had something to do with the psychological assessment.
Yes, and this is the important part of the whole dynamics of trust, especially when it comes to mental health. I knew this forensic psychologist for 30 years. And he'd been invited to Nathan's ceremonies, but he didn't go. And so when all this happened, I said, well, Roberta it took about 5 years before her brother and sister were under my care. And I took care of her sister for 7 years, 8 years after that. But it was during the time that I had custody of her brother and sister that I asked this forensic psychologist to help me, because she was breaking into my house. She was coming to see them without asking permission from me. So he interviewed her, and then he said to me that he recommended that she have supervised visitation. Okay, because my niece and nephew weren't under child and family anymore. Okay, so I didn't have any options but to find my own forensic psychologist to help me, so I have some legal documents in case she wanted to sue me or do whatever. I don't like if because again, she had Nathan, my relatives, people who were supporting Nathan that could have easily, challenged me. Um, Again, you got to understand, my niece that I took care of was of the was the ripe age that Nathan was had a propensity for. 8 year anywhere from 8 years to 15 years old. She was in that range. So when the forensic psychologist interviewed her, he said she's a danger to herself and others. And I said, in what way? He says, Marina, if she goes, you let her take her brother and sister to whoever she's associated with in Calgary, wherever she's living, and if they're selling drugs or if they're capable of sexually assaulting children, she wouldn't know the difference. And I said, what do you mean? He says she can see that your brother sexually assaulted her, and she charged him. But she cannot see that Nathan Chasenhorse has done the same thing. She cannot differentiate between these two men. They're both doing a crime. She cannot comprehend that they're both the same. And because of that, she's a danger to the safety of her brother and sister. Therefore, if you need my recommendations, if you have any trouble establishing boundaries with her that she cannot visit her brother and sister, I'm here. So that's how it all started. Because they weren't under child and family anymore.
So going with that, Marina, there was more ongoing challenges with the family after all of this came out and the supervised visitation with Roberta and the siblings. What were some of those challenges that you witnessed and experienced?
Well, she just basically ghosted me. She never wanted, after she realized she couldn't have her way, she didn't bother. She knew that the only way that she could have visitation would be if there was an adult present, and she didn't want that. So for I think the rest of her life, like she was involved in prostitution. She'd been banned from like a hotel. She got, when she turned, I think she was just 17, 18. It's the same time my brother was sentenced. She was arrested in one of Calgary's largest drugs confiscated, and guns and stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. She was dangerous. My brother was attacked with a machete and almost died. So, and Roberta had taken a golf club to her own mother. When her mother was dying of cancer, they had to ban her from coming onto the ward because she would physically fight her dying mother. Like like I had to really make sure that I did the best I could for my niece and nephew. And this is the matriarch part of me, because I was taking care of my mother. My mother did not have the capacity to do all this fighting and establishing for her grandchildren. So I had stepped in, and because of that, I took the brunt of the abuse from my family.
Yeah. So after Nathan chasing horse was banned by certain community chiefs, so what was the community response of the area after all of this happened?
Well, one of the victims, she met him when she was 14, and he sexually assaulted her, took her to a motel on McLeod Trail when she was the following week when she turned 15. I'd been in touch with her with text messages, and when he was banished, that was part of the whole part of the motivation, was nothing was being done. Information was gathered, and I was networking with her saying, well, Roberta knows. So there was always this, like, okay, they tried to find records where Roberta had disclosed to police, but there was nothing found. But my talking to the other victim was to help her realize, like, no, Roberta is doing something.
Mhm.
So there was hopefully some hope that the papers would be filed. And at the point the victim had said it's gone to the judge, it's gone to the court so they can lay charges, but it never happened. But at least the word was out that these things had been happening, even though there were still nation members, females, who were still living with Nathan Chasing Horse.
Mm, okay. And so moving forward with the witness accounts and disclosures of community concerns, what were the interactions with the forensic psychologist and the community after all of that? And Nathan was arrested.
Oh, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do the blog, because this past week, our chief was arrested with 2 counts of sexual assault. Now, this forensic psychologist, and mind you, I've had this explained to me every time since 2023, and say, well, he had, ethics, he had obligations to maintain confidentiality of his clients. I said, well, I know that. Why do you think I just decided not to associate with him?
Mm.
I said, when the tribal police came to my home to apologize for the lack of skill, like a lack of, taking me serious, I said I invited the forensic psychologist because he could validate how dangerous Roberta was based on like, even if she, like, whatever records had followed Roberta with regards to Nathan, if they couldn't find it with the police, the forensic psychologist would have bore witness that he was involved with this whole thing to help me manage a relationship with Roberta and her brother and sister. So 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 when the Trump police came here to apologize, I invited this forensic psychologist because I wanted the tribal police to know, like, my niece and nephew weren't under Child and Family, but this is how dangerous Roberta was. And the fact that I had someone to actually, say, yes, Nathan Chasing Horse is a danger. I did not, I was not prepared for what I witnessed. I only knew, like I said, I knew this forensic psychologist for over 30 years. In the past 5 years, he was saying things like, "Oh, I don't like this chief. He enabled Nathan to be here all these decades," and he never disclosed to me why. Again, I never asked him either because I just thought it's none of my business. I know why. I know the reasons why I didn't want Nathan around. So anyway, in this room, this actual space here, the 2 tribal police were here, and the forensic psychologist disclosed to them, and I'm only saying this because I witnessed it. He said to them that this chief had been his client. He said to them, he said he was arrested in Ontario relating to an underground theatrical performance where a man was doing something to a boy, and that the police raided this establishment, and him and another band counselor were taken in with this whole audience, this whole people who were watching, and arrested. So this forensic psychologist disclosed this to the 2 tribal police. He's also, making reference with them. What I'm hearing him say is, like, they knew a lot of people because this forensic psychologist has had top level security clearance in Canada and in different parts of the world. Okay, so he's quite, people trust him.
Mhm.
So he's disclosing to the tribal police, and then he says that this chief has a propensity for boys. He disclosed this to the 2 tribal police. On top of him saying that this chief allowed Nathan Chasing Horse to come into Sutina, and they're listening, and I'm listening to what he's saying to them.
Mhm.
And then after they left, I thought, oh, see, these 2 tribal police,
Mhm.
they're no longer working for the nation. So after they left and all things started happening, and the trial, like if Nathan Chasehorse was going to go into trial, and all this was happening, and like I don't know how many times his trial has been delayed, but anyway, I thought, why didn't this forensic psychologist anonymously disclose what this chief had, like, that had been arrested in Ontario? Why didn't he do that?
Mhm.
Because if he did, then this political leader wouldn't have been given the opportunity to run for election again.
Mhm.
So that was my concern, and that's why I thought, no, I can't trust this guy. Why would he disclose this in front of the tribal police? And again, that's okay. I'm not any person of authority. He didn't have to tell me this, but I want people to know that I witnessed it and I saw him and the two constables interacting.
Mhm. Okay. So listening to what you've been talking about with the Nathan chasing horse experience and then the two gentlemen that have come out recently with the sexual assault disclosures, why is it important for us to listen and to support the speaking out of these things happening when it comes to um, these like more recent disclosures as well as the old disclosures, and how do we bear witness to that?
Well, I think just giving support to the victims is important. I had one of the children who had left with Nathan as she grew up to be a woman say that I wasn't supporting the victims. But the question is, how am I supposed to support? Do I support financially? Like the only way I can support is to say to community, support them, believe them. It, not once have I discredited them in saying that I don't believe them. I do know I can't even comprehend what they've had to go through
Mhm.
and what they had to like the control he had over them.
Mhm.
That's not for me to decide. And I think it's the same thing with these two men. I can't even comprehend the kind of control this chief had over them. And this is why I think it's so important that people have got to understand these are people who have control, who have an addiction over controlling others. This whole need to control people all stems, I believe, from colonialism, systemic racism, Indian residential school, the general public, the general population wanting to assert that through divine, what they call it, divine intervention or divine destiny, that some authority, religious authority, has deemed that Indigenous people are less than. And for me, victims are not less than. There are just thousands and generation after generation of Indigenous people who have not had justice. And the fact that these young men and these young women are doing it. See, when I was sexually assaulted, um, it it was published after he was found guilty. See, in this case, it's published that he was arrested. This chief was published, and they're openly saying if there's anybody else who's been victimized, come forward. It's the same thing with Nathan Chasing Horse. He was arrested. They're asking for other people to come forward. So because of that, with Nathan Chasing Horse, people from Montana have come forward, people from Alberta have come forward, and from British Columbia and other places. Now, because it's published, and this is just 30 years from the time I went to court, by the time I had the disclosure, because mine was historical too. I was sexually assaulted at 19, and then 30 years ago, the guy was sentenced. So, and it wasn't published. Like I said, it was published after he was found guilty. Now, before all that, the RCMP had investigated in Sutuna for 6 years. And they never told me. They never told me, because if they had told me, at least I would have prepared my family. My younger brother, who respected me, he came up to me one time. He says, Marina, people are telling me to tell you to keep your mouth shut. He says, I'm just minding my own business, and this guy just came up and just punched me in the face. He said, what for? See, I didn't know that the RCMP were questioning everybody because of the laws back in the 70s stated that anybody who was sexually assaulted had to disclose within the year. So they were asking people, and they found through their interaction that there were over 12 women, older women than myself. I was the youngest, they said, who had disclosed that they'd been sexually assaulted by these two serial rapists. And they didn't want to come forward because the laws in the 70s were different than they are today. So a lot of these things that are coming up and the support for victims is finally happening.
So there are some questions around individual persons' motives and responsibilities that they might come off as being well intentioned for the community, but actually they're serving their own interests. How do we kind of keep an eye out to as community members and to keep an eye out for that so that we can work together for
Well,
collective healing?
well, it's again women. Bless us women. I think because we have a false sense of that we have power. I think because like when we're in the workforce and say I'm working and I'm not doing my job and I have suspect that they're going to fire me. I would run to this chief. Oh, help me, or the band counselor. Oh, help me, and and they'd intervene and they'd save my job. But did I learn anything from it? No, I just learned to go and go and tell on somebody so I could save my job. So so as a woman, like I'm relying on somebody, I'm associating with somebody in a position of power, so I'm safe for my job. But realistically, how safe am I as the woman if I'm doing that? So I think for women, we have to learn to stand on our own 2 feet, get an education, pay for our own way, our education. I paid for my tuition, paid for my degree, paid for my travel expenses, worked full time, paid for my rent, paid for my food. As women, we need to do that. And I think sometimes when a woman is a single parent and they're afraid to lose their job, they will compromise.
The last section of this conversation, Marina, comes to community leadership, the ethical concerns, and the disclosure issues that happened um, regarding Nathan chasing horses, continuous presence in Satana over the years. So how has that been an issue in the context and the concerns that it raises?
Well, I know the women who had children with him had hired lawyers to seek out like financial gain, like financially, they wanted to know that he had made money. And a lot of the money that was given to Nathan Chasing Horse from community was given in cash. Because when I was doing this, I saw $5,000 given in cash to him for ceremony. So during those before 2015, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the money wasn't written out in a check. It was written out in cash to different like managers or like again, let me put it this way. There are 16 terabytes of information that the courts have on Nathan Chasing Horse. The trial has been delayed over and over again, and in January 12th, 2026, they're going to have a preliminary hearing. In that preliminary hearing, because he's got new lawyers, they're going to show everything. Forensic audit. There's going to be like probably money laundering, tax evasion, um, what is it? Money laundering, racketeering, sexual assault, human trafficking. All the information, all the people who text money, all the people who emailed him, everything. They have all that. They've got all his pornographic child videos. They've got all this evidence against him. And the reality of it is, like, he has a choice to decide if he's going to plead guilty or not guilty at the preliminary hearing. If he chooses to plead guilty, he will be sentenced. There'll be no trial. All the evidence in the preliminary hearing is confidential. It will not be published. If he pleads not guilty and he goes to trial and he's found innocent, he will be extradited into Montana to face those charges. Those are federal charges because it happened on a reservation. Okay, so how many years is that going to be tied up? And if he pleads not guilty in Montana and he gets off, he's going to be extradited into Canada. So again, he comes into Canada. If he pleads not guilty and he's found guilty, he serves 4 years in Canadian penitentiary because that's the maximum here, whereas in the States it's life. The propensity for him to reoffend is greater in Canada than the United States. But the reality of it is, like, how many decades is he going to be going through the court system?
A really good question.
See, and for what's happening right now, say this leader is found guilty and he goes to prison. Within 4 years, he's out. He's out in the community, and what is the likelihood of him reoffending? And this is where what they call it, restorative and transformative justice takes place.
So in conclusion, Marina, what are your your current personal involvement and concerns in what's going on with both Nathan and the current disclosures with respects to ethical considerations and confidentiality?
Well, I think in terms of ethics, I think leadership needs to take a firm stand. When you take on a leadership role, especially in a community where you're supposed to be protecting women and children and the most vulnerable, that you really take into consideration. That wasn't done. For me, if I were one of those girls that they paid rent for Nathan, I would sue chief and council. Because what were they doing? If I were one of the victims and I was under the age of 18 and the leadership did this, I would sue leadership because they weren't protecting me. Like, ethically, where does leadership get off doing that and not protecting women and children and the most vulnerable? So that's my whole podcast. So thank you for asking those questions, and I hope people with this podcast understand that this has been a long time coming. It's been decades of struggle with the leadership and even trying to get people to understand what it is to not hold ethical space and not have boundaries. It takes a lot of courage just to have a backbone. Like my late father and my late mother would say, you have to love yourself first. And my late father would say, it's important to have a backbone. And I know my parents, when they first met each other, they fell in love. And I truly believe that even my grandmother and my grandfather, when they first met each other, they fell in love. And these things that are healthy human sexuality mean something. That's why it's important to know the people that came before you and to honor them and show them respect. So with that, I thank you, and we'll do another podcast, continue updating these things. Thank you.